Hello and welcome back to the virtual classroom. I'm your host, Dr. Olmsted. As you can see, today's topic is the new imperialism. Now, as always, before we begin, take a moment and pause on this video, jot down the lecture outline to your right, and pay particular attention to those key terms at your left. You got it? Let's get started. Now, I guess if you understand the title here, you get it that we're talking about imperialism. And again, very important, let's talk about definition first. What is imperialism? Well, it is the control of one people by another. Quite a simple definition, where one people, one nation, one country is imposing its will upon another nation or people. And it can be done many ways. It can be full colonization, such as the case of, Britain with the 13 colonies. It can also be a little more abstract, such as political, economic, or cultural. Or it can be all of them, or it can be two of them, or it can be, there's a lot of variations to it. But the basic premise is there is some type of control from the outside, from one group of people onto another group of people. Now, imperialism itself is not new. In fact, what we refer to as the old imperialism, and again, the easiest example of that, of course, is the 13 colonies of what is now the United States with Great Britain. But this type of old imperialism occurred between the 16th and 18th centuries. At this time, the European powers were largely not interested in forming colonies in Africa or Asia. But rather in those areas, they were simply building trading stations. Now, Portugal, for instance, had established a series of trading posts along the west coast of Africa, India, and Indonesia. And in doing so, they controlled the spice trade. They were also the first to establish the slave trade, with Africa taking enslaved Africans to the New World. The Netherlands, the Dutch, likewise would establish trading posts in Indonesia and Sri Lanka. Europeans in Asia respected and frequently cooperated with local rulers in India, China, Japan, Indonesia, and other areas where trade flourished between locals and Europeans along those trading centers. Now, where the old imperialism really took place, of course, was in the Americas, where the policy was not working with local peoples, but rather, as we all know, just essentially slaughtering genocide against Native Americans. But things began to change in the 1800s. Not only had Britain lost the American colonies, not only will Spain lose much of its holdings in the Americas due to the Mexican Revolution and all the Latin American revolutions, but we're going to see this new type of immigration. We're going to see, beginning in the 1850s, we start seeing the colonization and imperialistic aspirations in Asia. And by the 1880s, we start seeing it in Africa. And the results are astounding. Let me give you a couple statistics. In 1800, Europeans controlled about 7% of the world's territories. Flash forward 100 years to 1914, on the eve of World War I. So in 1800, Europeans controlled 7% of the world's territories. By 1914, Europeans controlled a whopping 84% of the world's territory. The British Empire, just little tiny Great Britain. Well, by 1900, they controlled 25% of the world's population and 20% of the world's territories. As the old saying goes, the sun never sets on the British Empire. In fact, it was said that a person could travel around the world by railroad and sea, moving only through British territories. It included places like Australia, Canada, India, colonies in Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean. Europeans will colonize Africa and Asia by using military force to take control of local governments, exploiting local economies for raw materials that were required for Europe's growing industrial revolution. So, very simply, what are the causes of this new imperialism besides, well, money? Well, number one, money. It's the search for new markets and raw materials. You see, the Industrial Revolution created a surplus of goods, and capitalists needed new markets to sell their stuff. At the same time, these capitalists wanted new raw materials to keep building more and more stuff that they needed to extract from places in Africa and Asia. They would then use to make more stuff and then need new markets to sell more stuff. And so, raw materials, ivory and rubber from the Congo, diamonds from South Africa, cocoa from Niger, tea from China and Ceylon, Sri Lanka, cotton from India, spices from Indonesia. So number one reason, flat out capitalism, money. Number two reason, missionary work. There was a strong current of religious revivalism in the mid-19th century that occurred in Western Europe. And this new emphasis on Christianity was about spreading it into Africa and Asia. Missionary activities would prove far more successful in sub-Saharan Africa than it did in Asia or in the northern Islamic Africa. One of the most famous people in this situation was Dr. David Livingstone. He is considered the first white European man to go into Central Africa. And while he's there, he will conduct both humanitarian and religious work in South and Central Africa. Now, very famously, he kind of gets lost. Now, I don't mean that he himself was lost, but rather he stopped making contact with the outside world. And so Britain will send another explorer to find him. His name was H.M. Stanley. And he will find Livingstone, whom Westerners thought he was dead. And the newspaper reports from Stanley would create tremendous European interest in Africa. Stanley sought aid of the King of Belgium to dominate the Congo region. A third reason is new military naval bases to protect one's interests against other European powers, which will increasingly increase the haves from the have-nots. In other words, increase the resources and military might of the British at the expense of the newly formed nations of both Germany and Italy, who were quite late to the imperialistic game. And then finally, there's ideology, both nationalism and social Darwinism. Now, Herbert Spencer, who coined the term survival of the fittest under social Darwinism, he rationalized that the conquest of weak countries by stronger ones, more civilized ones, was just and right under the idea of survival of the fittest. It justified military superiority and conquest by Europeans. A second popular justification was called the white man's burden. Now, this was coined by famed author Rudyard Kipling, who famously wrote the Jungle Book. He also wrote a poem called The White Man's Burden. It was racist and patronizing, and it preached that the superior Westerners had an obligation to bring their superior culture to those quote-unquote uncivilized peoples in other parts of the world. In other words, to put it more bluntly, for these poor, civilized, wealthy, Christian Western nations, it was their sad, humble obligation, nay, their God-given duty to spread their superior culture and civilization upon all the heathen savages, those poor little children all around the world. It was their duty-bound, humble obligation. Now, if that sounded sarcastic and patronizing, it's the way it's meant to be. Because, quite honestly, while the stated goal is to seek and protect and improve the lives of non-Europeans, the basic assumption is flawed. Other peoples don't need Europeans to civilize them. They are who they are and they're happy. But nonetheless, things are going to begin to change in 1880. You see, in 1880, Europeans only controlled about 10% of Africa. By 1914, they will control all of Africa except for Libya and Ethiopia. Now, the first to go was Belgium. the Congo is going to become a colony of Belgium. And this begins in the late 1870s when Belgium took control of Congo following H.M. Stanley's reports. King Leopold II, at the behest of the British-American journalist H.M. Stanley, will establish trading colonies in the Congo and sign specious treaties with African chiefs to give Leopold full control of the Congo region. The Belgian rulers savagely treated the indigenous peoples in their quest for ivory and rubber. The Belgian parliament became horrified by revelations of the atrocities in the Congo and took the personal colony away from Leopold in 1908 to make it a Belgian colony. Britain's control of Egypt in 1883 became the model of this new imperialism. The Turkish general Muhammad Ali had made Egypt into a strong and virtually independent state by 1849. But Egypt's inability to satisfy foreign investors led to control of its finances by France and Britain. By 1875, Britain had bought a significant portion of shares in the Suez Canal and began to manage it to protect their investment. By 1883, Britain declared Egypt a protectorate, setting the stage for similar practices by other European powers. In this case, it was all over the money aspect of protecting their interests in the Suez Canal. So even though technically Egypt was part of the Ottoman Empire, it was actually controlled by Great Britain. Now in 1884 is the really big change. In 1884, Germany calls for the Berlin Conference. Now this was being done ostensibly because Germany was freaking out. Germany was a major industrial power in Europe, but because they'd only recently unified, they were late to the imperialism game. And they wanted their seat at the table. So in 1884, 1885, they called for the Berlin Conference to establish rules for conquests in Europe. It sought to prevent international conflicts between European nations over the issue of dividing Africa under imperialism. So the idea was, these kind of basic premise rules, that no imperial power, white people in Europe, could control or could claim a territory in Africa unless it effectively controlled that territory. And slavery and the slave trade would be terminated in Africa. Again, this is being sponsored by the German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck because they want to see the table. The result, the scramble for Africa was on. And the British will be especially horrific. Now, the British prided itself on supposedly being the most enlightened of the imperialistic powers, though its rule was extremely oppressive and horrific. For example, after taking control of Egypt, Britain then pushed into Sudan. And in the Battle of Omdurman in 1898, General Horatio Kitchener defeated the Sudanese tribesmen by killing 11,000 of them with machine guns, while the Britons only suffered 28 deaths. It got even more brutal when we go to South Africa in the Boer Wars. You see, in South Africa, Cecil Rhodes had become Prime Minister of the Cape Colony, the very south tip of Africa. He became the principal sponsor of the so-called Cape to Cairo dream, where Britain would dominate the African continent. Diamonds and golds had been discovered in the Transvaal region. And Rhodes wanted to extend his influence there, but the Boers control the homelands. Now, to understand, the Boers are descendants of Dutch white settlers. The Boers initially were successful in repelling the British troops. But in 1902, the Kruger telegram, Kaiser Wilhelm II dispatched a telegram to the Boers, congratulating them on defeating the British invaders without the need of Germany's assistance. The anger at Germany would sweep through Britain, and a massive British force would eventually defeat the Boers in 1910, and the result was the Transvaal, the Orange Free State, the Cape Colony, and the Natal would combine into the Union of South Africa. And ultimately, by 1890, Britain controlled Nigeria, Kenya, Uganda, and Zanzibar. Again, a huge, massive empire. Now, the French. Since 1830, the French had controlled Algeria in North Africa. The attack on French shipping by Barbary pirates was used as a pretext for this conquest. Algeria would remain under French control until the late 1960s. In Tunisia, in 1881, France would justify its annexation of Tunisia due to its frequent raids due to frequent raids into Algeria by Tunisian rebels. And Tunisia would become a French protectorate, much like Egypt became one for Great Britain. The French also controlled the northern Congo basin that had been recognized at the Berlin Conference, and French would also control French West Africa, including the Ivory Coast and the Sahara. Now, again, Germany, they were late to the game, but they are going to hit the ground running. And even though they weren't unified until 1871, they are going to make quick inroads into African colonization. The Berlin Conference guaranteed that Germany would now be a major player in Africa, and by World War I, Germany controlled territory in Africa 5 times larger than Germany itself. This includes Southwest Africa, that came under German control, where Germans were particularly brutal, as local rebellion resulted in Germans killing over 50,000 men, women, and children. Now, the last to arrive was Italy. The Eritrea region on the Red Sea became Italy's first colony in Africa in the 1880s. In 1896, Italian forces were defeated while trying to take Ethiopia. Of course, this becomes a major sticking point following World War I, because World War I, the Italians end up on the winning side, and they're upset that they did not get more African colonies, including Ethiopia. Which is why when Mussolini takes power in Italy, he is going to rectify this humiliating defeat of the Ethiopians over the Italians by conquering Ethiopia in 1935. Likewise, not only is this happening in Africa, it's also going to happen in China. And in China, Britain is going to make some huge inroads thanks to the Opium Wars. Now, the first Opium War, from 1839 to 1841, Britain will occupy several coastal cities and force China to surrender. It will result in the Treaty of Nanking in 1842 that gave Hong Kong to Britain until 1997. There was the creation of 4 treaty ports that were open to British trade, including Canton and Shanghai. British residents in China and other European visitors were granted extraterritoriality and were thus immune from Chinese law. Now, during the Second Opium War, 1856 to 1860, China would be forced to open 6 more ports to British and French trade indefinitely. China was forced to accept the trade and investment on unfavorable terms for the foreseeable future. What this ended up with, then, is China was technically still independent, but they were being dominated by outside European forces, and the result was what we refer to as spheres of influence. By the late 19th century, much of eastern China had become subject to domination by the British, the French, the Russians, the Japanese, and the Germans. Japan regained Taiwan as a result of the Sino-Japanese War in 1894. Britain gained a monopoly on the Yangtze River. France gained lease of the Canton Bay and a sphere of influence and trade of several southern provinces. Russia controlled northern Manchuria, seeking to build a railroad through the region. And Germany earned a 99-year lease at the port of Qingdao and concessions to build 2 railroad lines in the Shandong province. Also famously, the U.S. would demand an open-door policy to trade in China, resulting from an agreement that the imperialist powers in China would not interfere with any treaty port or the interests of another power. What this all means, what all those things meant, was that while China is still technically independent, it is being dominated under these spheres of influence by outside Europeans, including also Japan and the United States. Even if they aren't conquered physically, this is what we refer to as economic imperialism. They are controlling the economy, and they're even being exempt from Chinese laws. A second jewel, however, for the British was, of course, India. In fact, you might say that India became the crown jewel of the British imperial system. The Mughal Empire, controlled by the Muslims, fell apart in the 17th century. After the 7 Years' War, the British East India Company was given control of India and was directly accountable to Parliament. Robert Clive would capture the military posts of Madras, and England would oust France from India. The British East India Company took the last native state in India by 1848. Now, in 1857, there's going to be what's called the Sepoy Mutiny, an insurrection of Hindu and Muslim soldiers in the British Army that was spread in northern and central India before it was crushed, primarily by local native troops from southern India. The Sepoys resented the British taking control of the Indian states. The short-term cause was the British use of animal fat to grease rifle cartridges, which was sacrilege to both Muslim and Hindu faiths. The result, after 1858, India was ruled directly by British Parliament in London and administered by a tiny all-white civil service in India. The results would create some moderate reforms, including a modern system of progressive secondary education, basically to train Indian civil servants. There also were some irrigation projects, railroads, in fact 25,000 miles by 1900. Cotton became the fourth largest industry in the world in India. And in 1885, the Indian National Congress was formed. The purpose was for Britons to train Indians to run India along British ways. The idea was educated Indians, predominantly Hindu, increasingly demanded more equality and self-government, and finally, in 1946, after World War II, India would gain its independence. France. Well, in France, they were going to control modern-day Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. And, of course, they will hold that territory until after World War II. That, of course, will lead to some major issues, including the Vietnam War. Now, responses. Well, China in 1900 will begin the Boxer Rebellion. It was a patriotic uprising of Chinese nationalists against Western domination. They were defeated by a multinational force of imperial powers in 1900, and the Manchu dynasty would soon fall thereafter. But it does give rise to Dr. Sun Yat-sen, a revolutionary who sought to overthrow the Manchu dynasty and establish a republic in China, sparking the beginning of the Chinese nationalist movement. Now in Japan, up a little bit, in 1853, U.S. Commodore Matthew Perry had forced Japan into open trade. Now, unlike China, Japan took the lead and quickly modernized to become themselves an imperial power by the late 19th century. In fact, they're the only major Asian power to resist being swallowed up by Europeans. In 1867, they experienced the Meiji Restoration, a series of reforms to compete with the West, and they showed their mettle. In 1904, Russia and Japan both wanted to control Manchuria and Korea and went to war with each other in the Russo-Japanese War. The result? Japan destroyed the Russian fleet off the coast of Korea and won major battles on land, despite Russia having a much larger population. Westerners were horrified that this tiny little Asian nation, supposedly these inferior people by their logic, the white man's burden, they're horrified that these Asians beat a Western power. It would lead to the Treaty of Portsmouth that was mediated by U.S. President Theodore Roosevelt that ended the war with Japan winning major concessions. Now, there were several opponents of this, including, of course, famously, Karl Marx, who 1867 wrote Das Kapital, who claimed that the bourgeois constantly needed expanding markets to increase profits, which would lead to conquest and lots of death. Another opponent of imperialism was J.A. Hobson. He was one of the most prominently anti-imperialist theorists. He stated that the imperialist powers needed colonies in order to provide new markets for domestic European goods, but that he claimed that businessmen and bankers unduly influenced government imperialist policies because, the governments did not need this territory. The capitalists, the bankers, the investment people, They're the ones who needed it. And thus, imperialism was really not about the government, but rather about the wealthy businessmen, the one percenters. And as Hobson explained, he believed that if European governments forced businesses to raise wages for workers, this would result in an increase in consumption of goods at home and less need for new markets abroad. As a result, anti-imperialism would increase throughout Europe as a result of both Hobson's work among other works. Of course, a major proponent of this idea was, of course, Vladimir Lenin of Russia, who saw imperialism as leading to colonial rivalries and ultimately war, World War I, which is where we will turn our attention to next. So until then, take care and bye-bye.